He shoved the wicker basket toward her with a laugh that had no warmth in it. And the moment Elena lifted the lid, the smell of roses and wet earth hit like a betrayal. Underneath the tangled roots, wrapped in yellowed music paper and a lover's letter, lay the cold, compact weight of a pistol. Her fingers found the metal before her face could shape the question she knew would come, and for a breath she could only imagine her father's hands, calloused and secretive, slipping something like this into her small palms and saying, "For when the world forgets how to be fair." The men in the doorway watched her the way vultures watch a bone, and Elena felt the room tilt and the years snap tight around her throat. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected claims, broken bonds, or awakenings under the moon, subscribe and stay close. Now, back to the scene. Salvatore Mancini did not need to step inside La Rosa Sincera to know the shop belonged to a woman who kept secrets. The alley announced itself in an arrogant hush of laundry and pigeons, and the little brass bell over the door announced him more politely than he liked. Elena straightened, the pistol hidden at the base of one wrist by the folds of her apron, and for an instant their eyes met. His, gray and impassive, the eyes of a man who had watched too many people promise things they could not keep. Hers, green and raw at the edges, a color she had cultivated like stubborn moss through grief and long nights on the bench arranging stems. "You don't have to say anything yet," Salvatore said, and his voice was cultured, as if this were a meeting about bank ledgers rather than contraband under roses. He smelled of expensive tobacco and a leather that had been polished 100 times by one pair of hands. He took in the shop with the slow appraisal of a predator measuring whether prey would be worth the chase. "But I would rather hear from you than from someone else's teeth." Her hands did not tremble in the way they used to when the police passed by her window. This was a different kind of fear, honed by sleepless nights and a ledger of debts that had no margin for error. "You found them," she said, "because the truth was small and sharp and would make a cleaner cut than a lie." She set the pistol down on the counter with a movement that was almost ceremonious, and watched the way his jaw tightened. He did not flinch when she revealed the others. Small knives wrapped in oilcloth, a flare gun, a length of chain with a hook. They looked like tools from a trade that had nothing to do with tending peonies. But Elena had learned to wrap the necessary things in beauty so people would not notice. Salvatore knelt to look into the basket as if he were inspecting a crime scene or admiring a painting. "You think this clever?" he said softly. "You think hiding beneath pots will keep you safe from me?" "I never thought it would have to," Elena answered. She met his gaze, and there was something in her that refused to submit simply because the man before her could order her life to be closed. "My father was a man who owed me," Salvatore finished. The words landed like an old stone sliding into place. He had not known the warmth of the man who taught Elena to prune tillers and lies. He only knew the ledger of debts unpaid. He slipped and he sank, and you planted roses on a grave made by his choices. There was grief inside her that could be catalogued like a collection. One sorrow for the father who left behind an unpaid tide of mistakes. One for the way the town had turned away. One for a childhood that had been half bravery and half calculation. But the newest, hottest thing was irritation that burned very close to anger. The irritation of being parceled into a story she had been trying to outgrow. "I planted roses to feed myself," she said. "I hid what I had to because no one would have given me the chance otherwise." Salvatore stood then, the motion sudden and exact. He was taller than she expected, a physical presence carefully wrapped in fine clothes that were never untidy. "You have been busy," he said, "not just with roses." When he spoke her name, it was not a question. Elena Martelli, you are not as ordinary as you like to be. Around them, Palermo continued, a city that held its breath whenever the Mancini name passed from mouth to ear. People recognized Salvatore in the market, in the church doorways, in faces pressed to tiny shop windows. They spoke of loyalty as if it could be traded like bread. But the story he told himself was different. It was the story of a man maintaining order in a chaos of ambition. In La Rosa Sincera, his presence made the air cooler the way shade moves across a walkway, subtle and inevitable. "Why don't you shut the shop and come with me?" Salvatore suggested, as if offering a minor kindness. "There are questions to answer." Elena laughed, a quick sound that had no humor. "You have men who will watch me. You have eyes on every alley." Her voice dropped, and for a sliver she feared she sounded like the little girl who had once watched her father be dragged away under chain lights and promises. "You will not get the truth in a parlor. You will get the truth wherever someone threatens what I love." It was a defiance that was less bravado and more a brittle attempt to maintain control over any tender ground left in her life. Salvatore looked at her as if weighing each pebble in the palm of his hand. Then he unfolded a small card and slid it across the counter. Her name and address were written in an angular hand she did not recognize, and beneath her name a time for a second meeting. "You can refuse me," he said. "You can bury more than you can carry, but the world is changing, Elena. There are people who would take what is hidden and use it to make the city scream. I will not have my name dragged through that kind of dirt." The implication was not a threat, it was an assignment. Salvatore's gaze was an iron door. If he opened it, he could ruin her, and if he closed it, he might shelter her. Elena felt the old marrow test, survival or surrender. There were other men who might have bent her in half with a glance, but Salvatore's power was subtler. It was a promise made in the voice of a man who thought himself both judge and benefactor. "You're offering protection," she said, more to untie the knot in her head than to negotiate. "For something." "For obedience," Salvatore corrected gently. He smiled then, a brief motion like a photograph catching light. "For the continuation of the trade you keep, for arranging things that might otherwise be arranged by someone less aesthetic." Her pulse stuttered at that, his audacity, yes, but also the seed of amusement. "You could force me," she said, and watched him. "I want you to." That thought trembled in her like a bud wanting to open in winter. "You could take the shop, the plants, the money. Why not do it?" "Because I prefer bargains to theft," he said. "Because it's more interesting to see whether a woman with ink-stained fingers knows how to keep her nerve under pressure. And because," he waited, and the ellipsis was a door swinging open, "because sometimes the thing hidden in the rose is more useful to me than the rose itself." Matteo found his place in the doorway then, a young man whose loyalty wore the slashed corner of a uniform and a habit of looking sideways. He had known Elena since she was a girl, and their shared history was a tangle. He had been the kid who delivered parcels to her father, the one who kept secrets when that was profitable. For a moment, Elena wondered if she should have seen his presence as a warning. Matteo inclined his head to Salvatore like a soldier greeting his captain. But when his eyes met Elena's, the expression there was complicated. Little boy who had been rewarded and corrupted by the world. Little traitor who had learned to translate pain into advantage. "You work with," Salvatore's voice took on the measured coolness of a ledger. "You work with what you must. I will give you a choice." Elena considered walking out into the alley, lifting the bell to send a message to anyone who might listen that she was not ready to be claimed. Instead, she put the syringe-thin trimming scissors back into their slot and faced him fully. She had lived long enough that fear had learned to sit beside calculation. To live was to be practical, even when it hurt. "What's the choice?" she asked. 1. You keep the shop. You continue your deliveries. No men hurt, no retaliation. You work quietly. 2. You stop hiding and become part of the family. He did not use the word family lightly. For Mancini, it was a currency. Neither is pleasant. Both are binding. Elena laughed again, and this time there was something cruel behind it. "You want me to be a florist with a ledger," she said. "You want to turn my grief into profit." "I want you to be useful," Salvatore corrected. "I have little patience for sentiment, Elena. I do not want the city broken. I do not want our name sullied. But I also appreciate skill. And there are talents you possess that are valuable." She imagined the pistols wrapped under burlap, the letters that smelled of lilacs and old promises, the ways survival had made a domestic art out of deception. She imagined her father's face, lined and crooked with shame and love, and how he had taught her to fold paper so that secrets lay flat and would not be seen. There was a part of her that wanted nothing more than to refuse him completely, to smash the weapons into the stones and hand him the keys with an insult beneath her breath. But the ledger of debts was not yet balanced. She still owed in ways that blood could not clear. Finally, she nodded. "I'll hear your terms." Salvatore's smile widened, almost pleased. "Good. Come tonight. The old warehouse on Via Capellini. Bring the things you have left. Bring nothing else." Outside, the city moved like tide. Shouts, a mother's voice calling kids, the clink of bicycle wheels on cobblestone. Inside La Rosa Sincera, the air smelled of rose oil and a world that had not yet decided whether it would be kind. Elena arranged a bouquet with distracted fingers, the motions becoming meditation. For a woman who had known how to hide an arsenal beneath petals, this moment felt like the first time someone had read her a price. Between a bouquet and a bargaining chip, she felt the tilt of fate, and the petals trembled like a hand in prayer. Elena folded the bouquet tighter until the stems clicked together like teeth, and the scent of damp earth and roses filled a space that no man could reach. The sun had gone soft by then, slanting through the slotted shutters and painting the counter in bars of gold. She had always liked the hour when light became guilty, when it seemed to be hiding something. Tonight, the light made a halo of dust over her fingers, and every grain seemed to be wired to memory. She locked the front door and shoved the key into her pocket as if it were a talisman. Matteo walked along beside her on the narrow street, his footsteps silent in his boots, eyes always moving as if he kept catalogs of exits and people he might need to betray. "Salvatore prefers punctuality," he said, though the observation was more for himself than for her. "Salvatore prefers everything," Elena replied. She did not want to speak his name the way people did, with the softened awe of children telling ghost stories. There was a new awkwardness between her and Matteo now, a taut strand that hummed when they crossed. She had known him in a different light, before loyalty had been measured in favors, and favors in favors repaid with interest. The past lined itself into both of them like a seam. At the warehouse on Via Capellini, the city had already condensed into a shape of purpose. Lamps threw halos down on stacked crates. Men moved like punctuation marks, sharp and purposeful. Salvatore was there before she was, leaning against a column as if the stone itself had agreed to his presence. He wore a coat that fit his shoulders like a throne. He did not look surprised to see her, which made the small concessions in her chest all the more dangerous. "You're late," he said, and his voice had no humor, but there was a curiosity in it that felt like warmth in winter. "I had to close up," Elena said. Her hands had been busy arranging, a nervousness that made her fingers smell of sap. She had brought 3 baskets, one with the brittle pistol wrapped in music paper, another with a flare gun and chain, the third with letters she had never burned. She set them down like prayers and tried to look indifferent. Salvatore motioned, and 2 men carried the baskets to a small table under a harsh light. The inspection was clinical. The men uncased each weapon, turning them over like museum curators. They were thorough, but there was a slow reverence in how they handled the objects, an acknowledgement that even in the most profane trades, certain things were sacred. "How long have you been doing this?" Salvatore asked suddenly, and the question felt like a hand reaching toward a bruise. "Since my father." Elena stopped, because saying the words "since he was taken" made them too final. The truth had edges. She had learned to dull them. "Since I learned what people would do when hunger had a name." "Good answer," he said, and for a second his face softened in a way that was almost a confession. "You are sharp. You plan. You hide." "I also sell roses," she said, "and I water them. That's the rest of my life." "Some people live their rest," Salvatore replied. "They find calm in arrangement. They will use their hands for blood the way you use yours for petals." His words were not accusation as much as description. He catalogued traits the way a surgeon catalogues arteries. Elena wanted to tell him that her hands were not built for that the instruments underneath the wrappings were inherited because the world required them, not because she had a natural taste for anything violent. But then, in the soft dark between 2 lanterns, she felt the truth like a shape forming under clay. She had been practical because practicality kept the lights on, because a ledger demanded it, because tenderness without armor was a luxury her father had taught her was fatal. "Why me?" she asked. "If you're so careful, why pick me? Why not the men who traffic bodies and names in the side streets?" Salvatore's expression shifted. For a man who sold fear like currency, he was not always forthright about the motives that moved him. "Because you are visible without being loud," he said. "Because people believe what they want to believe about you. Because you make even danger pretty and therefore more useful. And because you are stubborn. I prefer those who resist when they are worth my time." Her mouth wanted to form a retort. Instead, she felt the strange, dangerous thrill of being seen. There was a humiliation threaded through that sensation, beautiful and humiliating both, that made her cheeks hot. He had made a calculation, and she, like the rest, had been catalogued. But in the way he catalogued, there was also the first hint of respect, like a careful hand acknowledging a blade. "Salvatore," Matteo interrupted, and there was a new edge in his voice that Elena avoided looking at. "There's word from the inspector. He wants to sweep the east docks tomorrow. He thinks there's a leak to the Mancinis." Elena's scalp tightened. A sweep meant arrests. It meant men who could make a life disappear with the flick of a file and a handshake. It meant the risk that her small network would be exposed, and the letters in her pockets would become evidence of something worse than survival. Salvatore was still then, and in the stillness she read a calculation. "Inspector Rinaldi gets his teeth on one angle," he said, "name like a shard. We will not give him another." "And me?" Elena asked, and suddenly her voice had the brittle sound of someone holding too much in. "If they sweep and I have what I have—" "You will be safe," Salvatore said, "if you are useful." The bargain unfurled in ways she had not expected. He wanted her to make deliveries on his timetable, to use her commerce as camouflage for movement he deemed necessary. He wanted receipts of loyalty written in small acts, not grander displays. In her head, petals and pistils braided together like a noose. She had not wanted to be useful in his sense. She had wanted to be useful in a way that fed the shop and kept her father's memory from rotting into shame. Now usefulness came with a cost, favors paid in fear, a handful of nights when she would risk everything for his sake. Outside the warehouse, a courier was grabbed from the shadows and roughly led away. Elena's heart lurched to her throat at the sight, the practical fear returning like a trained dog. The courier's eyes met hers for a long second and then dropped. She recognized him, an unremarkable man who had once taken a customer's order, and in his look was the fundamental awareness that nothing was purely one thing. People survived by buying into illusions. Tonight, she understood the depth of the trade more clearly. People would work the illusion for coins and sleep lightly. The next days bled into one another in a rhythm that was both mechanical and intimate. Elena learned the rules of his world by bedside manner and silence. She dropped baskets at small apartments guarded by men whose eyes told stories of cheap hotels and children with names they had never said aloud. She marked routes in the way a cartographer marks coastlines. Danger here, watchful eyes there. Salvatore watched sometimes, not with the constant scrutiny of a jailer, but with the selectiveness of a man savoring fruit. His presence became a weather system that shaped how she moved, sometimes warm, often stormy. Once, under a sky that had the bruised red of a wound at the horizon, Salvatore walked beside her across an open square after a delivery. No men accompanied them. The city was full of a kind of hush, as if it had decided to hold its words until dawn. Elena felt the hush like a form of mercy. "You could leave," Salvatore said finally. "You could pack your things and go to the north. Buy a little place where no one knows the name Mancini. Change your life." "I can't," she said. It wasn't a bravado, it was truth. She owed more than money. Debts had become a shorthand for the way her life had been structured. Her father, the shame, the fear of being small in a large, cruel world. He nodded. "You are brave in ways that are not obvious. You make courage small and habitual. That's what makes you dangerous." "Is that a compliment?" she asked, because she wanted to laugh and could not. "It might be," he said. A pause. Then softer. "Do you know why I came here and not just sent men? Because I wanted to see the person who could keep such a strange calm and still be alive." She almost scoffed. She had, until that second, thought of him as a silhouette who came to collect, like a tax. Instead, there was curiosity in his eyes, a personal hunger. The thought made the skin along her arm prickle. Their conversations in the days that followed were surgical. He asked about roses and the rituals of pruning. She learned, to her surprise, that he appreciated the specificity of sap and scent. She taught him names, gardenia, damask, coltsfoot, and he listened the way a man listens to a language he does not yet need. In return, he let her see slivers of a life that was otherwise carved in stone. The small regret he carried for a sister he had lost to a fever before he had decided to build an empire. The boredom that came with being obeyed. The loneliness that hummed beneath orders. It was dangerous, that softness. It felt like rain on a roof you thought was made of steel. Matteo's presence was a counterweight. He began to ask her things in a low voice. Where did she hide the letters? Whom did she trust? And sometimes his questions were tender in a way that unspooled memories. Once, as he helped her seal a package, his hand brushed hers, and the contact was brief but electric. He looked away quickly, a tell. "I'm trying to make things right," he said too quickly, and the phrase was both plea and promise. "By helping me?" she asked. His eyes flicked up as if surprised to catch her looking at him. He had always been clever at disguise. Now he seemed to be a man who had rehearsed too many faces. "Or by making yourself look clean." "Maybe a little of both," he admitted. Elena could not say whether the tilt in their complicated triangle was toward protection or ruin. Salvatore's interest had never been simple. He liked possession and order. Matteo's motives were mercurial, sometimes helpful, sometimes seedy. The city itself was a third player in the game. indifferent and necessary, like water. And in the middle of it, Elena felt herself negotiating not just possessions, but selfhood, the person she had been before debt, before burying arms under petals, and the person she might become if she continued to live within the orbit of men like Salvatore. One night, returning late from a run, she found La Rosa Sincera with its shutters open and the window dark in the way of someone who had forgotten to close a life. A player had left a note on the counter, a single name written in a scrawl she recognized, Rinaldi. The inspector was closing in, and the note was not an idle threat. It was a promise of a sweep. Elena's blood slowed. She knew what a sweep meant. Men dragged out of beds, evidence turned into accusation, shame given a uniform. She called Matteo, breathless, and he came within the hour, hands moving with the competence of someone who had learned to apologize with action. "Salvatore will be furious," he said, and she couldn't tell whether he meant furious at the inspector or at her. Salvatore came instead. He entered the shop and sat at her small round table without asking. On his face was a look she had not seen before, possession softened into a concern she might have misread as personal. He reached for a teacup and did not drink, merely curling his fingers around porcelain, as if the act could do something tender for him. "This is an open wound," he said. "They will try to cut into us with the inspector. We are not the kind of family that survives well under civic sanitation." "Then what do we do?" Elena asked, the question frantic now. She felt like a woman dangling over a well, and every answer was a rope that could fray. "We do what we always do," Salvatore said simply. "We contain. We make a story that makes sense. We choose a scapegoat, and we close ranks." The words were brutal. To be contained was to become less than a person, a thing to be used. Elena's stomach lurched with the knowledge that if the sweep came, people she had counted on, or thought she had, might be sacrificed so the Mancini name remained unblemished. She had not realized the depth of what her involvement meant. She had believed, in a naive way, that she could negotiate women's work into a life. Now it appeared that life might require collateral. "Not like that," Matteo said suddenly, his voice a knife. "We can do better. We can give them a trail. We can—" "No," Salvatore cut in. "We will not. We will not feed their hunger. We will not play by Rinaldi's rules." Matteo's jaw tightened. He looked at Salvatore like a boy measuring how a man would break. "And Elena?" he said. "What about her?" For the first time, Salvatore hesitated. Whatever the pause represented, a calculation, an emotion, Elena felt something shift between them like tectonic plates. He looked at her with an expression she could not name. It was not quite tender, and it was larger than possessive hunger. "We protect what is useful, and sometimes what becomes precious," he said, finally. Elena wanted to laugh. She wanted to scream. Preciousness was a dangerous label. It elevated something fragile and placed a target on its forehead. To be told she was useful and precious at once made her feel like a thing on a pedestal and an animal at a butcher's window. "We set a game," Salvatore said then. "We mislead Rinaldi. We offer him bones that won't bite back. And you," he turned to her, "you will keep doing what you do, but you will not be alone." There was an offer wrapped in thin steel. To continue meant to be enveloped by his world with its rules and armor. To refuse meant to risk being cut out of a life by men who had none of her gentleness. Elena realized then that she had been bargaining with more than physical danger. She had been bargaining with identity. The choice was not simply whether she would keep her shop or give it up. It was whether she would allow something like tenderness to require her to continue to hide, to act, to be used. She could feel the city holding its breath around them, as if Palermo itself were waiting for an answer. The light in her shop outside the warehouse made patterns on the cobble like old stitches. She had wanted to be left to the small life of arranging peonies, but fate, Salvatore, had other plans. "I'll do it," she heard herself say, though every fiber in her wanted to run. The words tasted like rust and sugar. "Good," Salvatore said, his voice oddly warm. "Then tonight we begin the theater." And so the theater began. They set up a trail of small crimes, contraband that led nowhere, rumors like breadcrumbs through the city. Elena wrapped messages in bouquets and slipped notes beneath petals. Matteo fed misinformation, sometimes tenderly, sometimes as if he were pulling teeth. Salvatore watched as if he were directing a play and taking in the way players moved, admiring here, correcting there. At times, when she delivered packages, Elena caught Salvatore watching her in a way that was no longer only calculating. Once, in a storehouse lit by a single globe, he caught her hand in his for the barest moment as he shone a small brass key between his fingers. The contact seemed to pass through both like a current. Neither of them commented. But it changed the code between them subtly, as if an extra rule had been added to their bargain, one that spoke of ownership that felt less like a contract and more like a dangerous, patient wanting. As acts of the charade accumulated and the inspector's interest wavered, Elena found herself thinking of the shop and the bouquet she had not yet arranged for a couple celebrating an anniversary. She thought of petals and pistils braided into a life she had not intended to choose. Each delivery was a risk, each conversation a new kind of intimacy. In the quiet hours after the theater scenes were played out, when men drank and laughed like hunger had finally been fed, Salvatore would sometimes walk her home. They would cross the city that was still and intimate, and he would tell her stories in the low voice of a man who had learned to supply cloakrooms of silence. "You are hard to hurt," he said one night as they paused on a street that smelled of lemon and diesel, "but you bleed in places you can't show." "I buried my bleeding," she said. It seemed sensible at the time. He looked at her then with an expression that was more complicated than proprietorship. "I would prefer to hold your bleeding in my hands than to let you do it alone," he said, a confession barely admitted. Elena's first instinct was to pull away, fear again, and the old knowledge that promises from men like him could be both sanctuary and trap. Yet the admission brushed something that had been dry and brittle inside her for years. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. To have a man who had the power to destroy tell you, quietly, that he might also protect the place that bled, felt like being offered a new kind of weapon. "I don't know if I can be held without being used," she said honestly. "Then we will have to learn," he answered simply. Learning, she suspected, would be dangerous, but somewhere beneath the fear, beneath the ledger of bargains and the choreography of survival, a small seed stirred. It was a fragile thing, rooted in the soil of old pain and the warmth of unlikely attention. If the Mancini world wanted to claim her usefulness, perhaps she could shape the claim. Perhaps, she thought, very quietly and with a coward's hope, perhaps power could be tender. The cell door slammed with the sound of a final thing being decided. Elena tasted iron and soap and a dozen regrets as the police placed her on the bench beneath the single green bulb that hummed like a wounded insect. The room smelled of damp cement and the kind of cold people carry when they are convinced a life has been rearranged without their consent. Her hands were cuffed in front of her because someone had decided it would be more theatrical, and she found herself surprised at how small the gesture made her feel, less like a woman and more like a thing surrendered to procedure. "Inspector Rinaldi has questions," said the man who had read the charges like a prayer book. He pushed forward a sheet with Elena's name across the top, a neat list of supposed offenses that made her blood run like oil. Conspiracy, trafficking, weapons possession. Each item was stamped with the civic certainty of a judge's rubber. The letters they'd found in her handwriting were included, and beneath each one the inspector had circled a phrase and written in a neat hand the words that cut, "Ties to Mancini Enterprise." She thought of the night the note had been left on her counter, of Matteo's frantic face at the shop, of Salvatore in the warehouse pronouncing strategy as if chess mattered more than flesh. She had wanted, in a foolish private way, to believe there were rooms in a man's heart where danger could be kept as a secret and warmth preserved. That belief had been naive. The city ate naivete for breakfast and left the bones to bleach. "They found the weapons beneath the roses?" Rinaldi asked, a small, malicious victory in his tone. He liked to be the man who unclothed the town's dirty laundry. He had the smile of someone sure of the pattern of his teeth. How very quaint! Elena stared at him. Her head felt hollowed out by the shock of betrayal. The letters, when they had been unwrapped in the station, smelled faintly of lavender and of the sea. One had been a child's scrawl about a promise made beneath a church window. Another had been a woman's handwriting, tight, sure, saying, "If you ever come home, do not knock." There were names folded into the pages like paper boats. Each name had been a lifeline once, an argument made in ink that had tried and failed to hold back consequences. "Who brought you in?" she asked the inspector, because clarity was a weapon she could still use. "Who watched the shop?" Rinaldi's eyes sharpened. "We had a tip," he said. "It came from within." He tapped the paper in a way that was both signal and sting. A man came forward, Elena Martelli. He said he'd been keeping an eye on you for some time. Matteo's face flashed in her mind like a blade. The boy who had delivered packages, the man who had brushed her hand. How long had he been practicing betrayal? How long had he been rehearsing the words that would turn her into evidence? "You sold us out," she said, and the sentence itself felt like a fall. Rinaldi's grin widened. He did his civic duty. He stood as if the law itself had been honored. He was quite persuasive, and he had a list. They brought her the list. Her stomach turned when she recognized the handwriting, Matteo's jagged present tense slashes, the way he crossed his T's as if they were fences. He had written names and places and times, notes about deliveries that matched the dates on the inspector's ledger. He had given them the map of her life. "Why?" Elena asked him finally, a single small question that had the weight of a novel. It wasn't about revenge or even about logic. It was about the ache of discovery. How had the boy who once lent his scooter to her father in desperate weather learned to transform proximity into a weapon? Matteo did not come to the station to watch her be processed. He had the decency of cowardice. He had the sense to hide until the consequences were less immediate. That absence stung like a rope cut at the knot. But the inspector took pleasure in showing her the recording. A man, Matteo, speaking into a recorder with the kind of practiced calm trained by a life that had become transactional. He spoke of debts, of fear, of being offered absolution in exchange for cooperation. He spoke of Salvatore, of names crossing lists like bloody stitches. When they finally took her out of the room, it was to a corridor where the light seemed to laugh at her. She found herself wanting the steady, monstrous comfort of Salvatore's face. Maybe he would come and place a card on the table and order a favor, and the world would fold again into the less awful shape she had been inhabiting. She found instead the absence of that face pressingly present. He did not come. The hours expanded into a kind of vacuum that allowed fear to breed. Elena sat on the bench and listened to the city outside. The ferries, the distant church bells, the life that found ways of continuing whether people were arrested or not. It was obscene, in a domestic way, that life could be so ordinary. When Salvatore finally entered the station, it was with the calm of a man who had practiced the weight of his steps. He did not stride, he measured. Inspector Rinaldi rose, like a man surprised to find his king at the table. Salvatore's presence recalculated the room. Men who had swaggered a moment before straightened, their hands becoming props in this suddenly theatrical world of power. "Elena," he said, and his voice carried like a slowly lowered curtain. He was allowed entry into the holding room like someone given a courtesy, and the officer who opened the door made a precise little bow. Elena rose when he approached because politeness was a muscle she could not let atrophy, even when the marrow beneath it had been chipped. His eyes found hers, and for a breath she thought, silly thing, that he would save her. He could. He had the right levers: money, favors, men in suits and in uniforms who owed him. He could call a dozen absolutions down like rain. Instead, he dropped to sit a respectful distance away and folded his hands like a man in church trying to find the correct prayer. "You must understand," he said quietly, "that some games I play are larger than one shop." "Then why?" she began. "Matteo chose," Salvatore interrupted. He said it with that economy he used for sentences where emotion might ooze out if it were given time. He offered information, and he offered himself. The inspector likes deals. "You offered him anything?" Her voice cracked, an involuntary confession that she had hoped wasn't true. The image of Salvatore making a concession for some pragmatic reason was more painful than the idea that he had not tried at all. He looked at her then with something that was not entirely flat. It had traces of something like regret. It was the light of a man for whom the life of a city sometimes meant making sacrifices that were not his to relish. "I negotiated," he admitted. "I bargained for certain men. I have certain limits, Elena. I will not—" He stopped, because what he would not do was not an absolute even to him. "I will not let the family be eaten by every scavenger who thinks teeth will serve as justice." Elena wanted to be furious. She wanted to sting him with how small his limits made her feel. The word family in his mouth now held a currency she could not buy into. It was as if she were a pawn in an old game, and he the player who decided when pawns were promoted or sacrificed. "You saved them," she said instead, the truth arriving like a small wet stone in her shoe. "You bargained for your men." "You let me?" "Not let you," he corrected, softer than she had any right to hear. "You chose a dangerous place to stand, Elena. I chose the path that kept the world from tipping into something I could not control. That means some people are protected, some people are exposed. I did not expose you because I wanted to harm you. It was a calculation." A calculation. The word landed in her chest like a hook. To be calculated into safety meant being measured, reduced, appraised. Her life, once secret and stubborn, had been run through an accounting ledger and docketed. "Am I one of those protected?" Her question was small and pleading, the kind that might be swallowed if answered wrong. Salvatore's jaw tightened. "You are one of those I choose to keep in play," he said. The answer was clinical and intimate, and it stung both ways. He had, in other words, decided her fate with the same dignity a butcher uses to pick a roast. She had expected rage or rescue. She had not expected the arithmetic of affection. Later, when the inspector's men paraded Marta Ferri, one of Salvatore's foot soldiers, through the public square as a warning, Matteo's face was there in the crowd. He did not meet Elena's eyes when the shackled man fell into the hands of the police. He looked, instead, like a boy who had given away his toys and then learned, too late, that he missed them. A fragment of Elena's heart wanted to break because of that look. The motion of his shoulders as he turned away was a small human thing that made her feel the coldness of the world more distinctly. The trial that followed was an ugly public theater. The inspector, hungry for headlines and promotions, turned Elena's art of concealment into evidence of a wider malaise. He read letters out loud in a voice that loved the sound of its own righteousness. He spoke of Mancini's reach and of the way small shops were often the veins through which darkness flowed. The judge, interested in his own reputation for efficiency, made quick work of testimony. Elena felt like a woman unstitched from her life. Salvatore visited the court each day, a shadow at the back who leaned as if holding something together by sheer weight. There were men who looked at him and saw a tyrant. There were, for others, merely a benefactor who kept the city's inconvenient truths under a glossy veneer. Elena had, until then, been trying to reconcile how someone could be both. Watching him in that room, the reconciliation felt impossible. Matteo testified, voice thin and trained. He told of fear, of threats given for the safety of his family. He said he acted in the public interest to avoid blood. He said it with the kind of conviction that only someone who had given up a piece of themselves could manufacture. Elena listened as the words flayed away any last trust she had kept like an inside coat. She thought of the nights he had touched her hand and of his eyes darting away. Little rehearsals for a betrayal that would be dressed up as heroism. When she was sentenced to a suspended sentence and community service, it felt less like mercy and more like a sentence that had been tempered to suit the parties involved. The judge read the decision with the clinched decorum of a man who knew to keep the peace when he could. Rinaldi smirked as if the inspector's victory had been complete. Salvatore waited outside the courthouse like a man who had been instructed to keep lookouts for the last of the dusk. He did not congratulate her. He took her hand in the corridor, a possession that shimmered between tenderness and requisition. And for a second, she understood the nature of his bargain. Protection rendered as ownership. "You are free to go," he said quietly, "but understand this, you will be watched." "By you?" she asked, the question at once naive and old. "By the family," he corrected, "and by those who owe us. It will be a different kind of life. I will be a part of it in some way." At that moment, Elena felt both claustrophobia and a perverse relief. The world had rearranged itself into a shape she recognized only because she had spent a lifetime folding things to fit into trunks of impoverished expectations. But the pain of Matteo's betrayal cut sharper than any other. He had been a hinge in the door of her life. He held it open long enough for the law to enter. And in doing so, he had shown how loyalty could be bought and sold. "Why did you do it?" she demanded at last, and the anger was the only clear thing left. "Why him? Why not stop it? Why let me be the one cut?" Salvatore's face, which often read as carved, flickered then. There was the shadow of a man who weighed his options like a miser counts coins. "I made choices," he said. "I am not a brute who stomps and leaves ruins. I manage what I must. I will not lose my men and my position because I romanticize a florist's independence." "You romanticize everything into purchase," she shot back. "You think because you can buy safety, you can buy people. You think you'll be kinder than the world, and you are not." He looked at her with a fatigue that was almost human. "Perhaps you're right," he said, "but I've been given a kind of calculus that demands certain sacrifices." She laughed then, not a pretty sound, but one clean with grief. "Sacrifices? You turned Matteo into one. You kept your men and let me be a lesson." "I kept my men," he repeated, like a man who admits a poor accounting was made and tries to claim its principle, "because I will not have a vendetta take the city into rubble." His reasons may have been real, they may have been strategic, they may have been the only options he believed possible. But to Elena they were cold and insufficient. She had not signed up to be a lesson for a man to keep his household intact. In the days that followed, the fracture widened. She kept the shop open because it was the last honest thing she had. But the light in La Rosa Sincera felt altered, no longer simply sunlit, but threaded with the blue of police tape in memory. Customers came and bought roses and never asked about the court dates. Mateo went quiet in town. His shoulders showed the strain of someone who had done something he could not undo. Salvatore continued to watch her, often from a distance, sometimes crossing the street when he could not resist. In his eyes, Elena found things that hurt and things that were patient. In the quiet of closing, she felt both gratitude and a nascent, bitter disappointment. It was a fracture that had the slow insistence of a winter river doing its work. It wasn't a single glorious moment of betrayal, but a long, clarifying erosion. Trust washed into peat, leaving only peat. At night, she sat on the back step and held a letter. A small, dog-eared thing that smelled of sea and the woman who had written it. It was from a lover who had left years before. She read it until the words blurred and saw the places inside herself that still wanted to believe that someone could choose her without calculation. She found herself wishing, ridiculous as it felt, that Salvatore might be that kind of man. Then the thought of Mateo's recorder and Rinaldi's smirk made her stomach twist. The fracture inside the lives around her had become the new geography. Alliances rearranged themselves like tectonic plates. In the center, a woman once believed to be only a florist, there was a hollow where tenderness and anger fought like cats in the dark. The city continued its indifferent orbit. And through it all, the pistils beneath the roses sat like secrets in soil, not yet revealed but fertile with the promise of consequence. They came for her at dawn. The city that morning was a watercolor of fog and pale light. Pigeons pecked like small accusations at the market square. Elena had gone to bed with her hands smelling of rose sap and lemon oil and woken to the world thick with a vigilance that felt like breath on her neck. She heard boots before she saw faces, men moving with that blunt certainty honed by warrants and morning coffee. Someone knocked at the shop door with a hammer's patience. It was an hour she had learned could shape destinies, and she had not yet learned how to soften the way it made her bones clatter. They did not take time for formalities. Inspector Rinaldi's men spilled into La Rosa Sincera like a stain and turned the shop into a theater of accusation. Cartons were upended, soil was overturned, petals were trampled with the indifferent haste of people who believed law was a tool to settle personal scores. Elena watched them move through her life as if she were watching a tide pull away the shapes of the shore. Her hands were cuffed again because the show needed a spectacle. Outside, the alley filled with murmurs. Someone called out the news, "She's taken," and small pockets of faces gathered like moths. The city loved a ritual of ruin, and Rinaldi was the sort of man who loved to give it. Salvatore arrived as if summoned by some inescapable gravity. He walked into the shop with that slow authority his presence always carried. The men who had been searching paused, the air thinning the way a held breath thins. His coat was still buttoned, though the morning had that wetness a storm leaves behind. His eyes found Elena among the overturned pots and the scattered petals, and for a second his face was simply a plane of stillness. "Stop," he said, and the word was a command that folded itself into the room. Inspector Rinaldi looked at him like one man meeting a larger shape than himself, and chose to translate the look into civility. "This is an ongoing investigation," he said, voice varnished with righteous indignation. "We are doing our duty." "You are making a spectacle," Salvatore replied evenly. If you continue, you give me no choice but to act. Rinaldi's jaw tightened. You cannot intimidate the law, Mancini. Salvatore smiled in a way that was not warm. I do not seek to intimidate. I seek to prevent damage to the city. Remove your men now, Inspector. Take your notes and close the shop again until we speak. There was a pause in which civility hung by a golden thread. Finally, Rinaldi gestured, and his men complied with an exaggerated patience. Outside, Boots retreated like tide, and the air filled again with the small sounds of a neighborhood that had been reborn. Elena stood there with tears on the crest of her lashes, but not yet spilling. The relief felt like a fragile thing, something that might break if the wrong person laughed. When the door swung closed behind the last of Rinaldi's men, Salvatore turned to her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, though his voice carried under it a sharper question: did this cost too much? She found that the afternoons of endurance had trained her for calibrated responses. Just shaken, thank you. He hesitated. There was a weight in how he measured thanks, a calculus always present between them now. You deserve to be thanked, he said simply, not for what you have done in service to anyone, but for staying alive. She wanted to answer with something that would speak of independence, not gratitude purchased by his intervention. But the sting of being as small as she felt softened the edge. "Why did you come?" she asked instead. "Why save me now?" He looked at the ruined bouquets lying like casualties on the floor. For a moment, he seemed to be measuring something that had no ledger. "I could not let your life be a lesson for men like Rinaldi," he answered. "I will not have my city policed by men who think justice is a performance." The words should have been balm. They were not. They were an admission that felt like ownership. Elena realized then that the theater they had been playing, misdirection for an inspector, a bargain for survival, was no longer only about survival. It bent into other shapes. It was about a man who could choose to keep people. It was about a woman who had to choose whether she would let herself be kept. She spent the day cleaning the damage with unhurried hands. Each petal she scooped up felt like a small reclamation. Salvatore remained at a distance, under the awning, his silhouette folded into a chair like a statue that had learned to be restless. He sent men to help with repairs and to make calls. He kept the shop from becoming another headline. The gesture was practical and possessive at once. Night fell around them like a silken glove. Salvatore stood to go, hand hesitating as if he had rehearsed leaving 1,000 times. For the first time she saw him slow down in a way that had nothing to do with caution. "Tomorrow," he said, "we will set something in motion to end Rinaldi's efforts. We will remove his leverage." Elena's stomach flipped. "How?" "Evidence," he said. "Proof that his accusations are built on muddy, paid testimony. We will expose the inspector's corruption. We will make him the scandal he deserves to be." It sounded like a grand thing, a cleansing. It also sounded dangerous. Elena had watched too many people promise things with the flourish of a man signing a check. Promises were currency he had more of than she did. She wondered if she was about to be used as bait again, or if this time the net was a genuine rescue. "Who will help?" she asked. Salvatore's jaw tightened. "People with no love for Rinaldi's ambition," he said. "And a man who owes me a favor big enough to be dangerous. Matteo." Her breath stopped so abruptly she felt as though she had been struck. Matteo. The name tasted like bitter coffee. He had turned her life into a transaction. Yet Salvatore had a way of turning even the treacherous into tools, sometimes to be used, sometimes to be healed. She did not know which Matteo would be sent to her, the betrayer, or a boy who would, finally, act to right what his hands had done wrong. When Matteo arrived that night, he did not come to comfort her. He came to her with a look that was as if he had been stripped of a mask and had nothing left to bargain with. He offered no excuses at first. Instead, he placed a small envelope on the counter between them. It was heavy with the sort of things that carry proof, receipts, names, a recorder on which he had captured Rinaldi taking a bribe from a man who claimed to be an independent witness. "I recorded him," he said, voice raw. "I wasn't." He stopped. The sentence collapsed under a weight. "I was a coward. I did what I was told. But he promised me a clean slate. He wanted me to create a trail, and I'd been so stupid to think it could stop at a trail. He wanted names to take, Elena. He wanted you as leverage." The confession was a choked thing. "I came to realize he would take everything if allowed." Elena studied him and found, in the angles of his face, the evidence of suffering. He was smaller somehow, as if his betrayal had been a blade that cut his own self down. "Why now?" she asked quietly. "Why risk yourself?" "Because I could not live with what I had done," he said. "He would have eaten more. I could not let him take your shop. I could not let him make you a martyr to his ambition." The words landed like small, tentative pebbles. Elena had built a wall of betrayal so tall around herself that she had forgotten mercy might find windows. Matteo's hands trembled when he reached for hers. His fingers were not steady enough to touch without apology. She felt the urge to flinch, to punish him for the wound his treachery had made. Instead, she let her fingers close around his for a moment, not in forgiveness. She could not give that without time, but in recognition of a man who had learned the cost of his choices. "We expose him," Salvatore said behind them, voice as flat and certain as an executed plan. "We give Rinaldi something that blows him right out of the inspector's office. We ensure that your name goes quiet because the city will be too busy examining its own rot. It is the only clean way to ensure you are not the scapegoat." It was an ugly maneuver, a radio of corrupt truths trading themselves for a greater good. Elena had always recoiled from grand politics. Yet, as she listened to the plan unfurl, with its risks and strategies and the way men were reshaped into instruments, she felt something else awaken. A fierce, extraordinary resolve. If their strategy meant she would have to be exposed again, then she would prefer the exposure be hers, full and deliberate, rather than a martyr sacrifice arranged by other people's convenience. "I will help," she said, "on my terms." Salvatore studied her like one studies a map. "Name them," he said. "Name your limits." She thought of the shop, of the roses that would need tending, of the ledger of debts, and the way loyalty could be an anvil or a shelter. "No one dies," she said finally. "No one else is sacrificed to cover an inspector's ambitions. We expose truth. We take him down, and I walk away without blood on my hands besides what I will bear for defending myself." It was a small clause, a moral architecture she would not budge from. They all agreed, though Salvatore's eyes darkened with the awareness that promises cost more in currency than he had perhaps expected. Matteo, standing there with his guilt like an armor he could not discard, nodded so hard it seemed he might break. The plan unfurled like a slow, patient bloom. They planted controlled rumors, small scandals that would bait the right ears. They leaked a trace of Rinaldi's bribery to a journalist with a fondness for uniforms gone crooked. Elena arranged a bouquet as partisan evidence, a bouquet that would be delivered to a known associate with a note that invited the inspector to show his hand. It was theater and insurgency braided. The night they moved felt like a storm. Salvatore's men shadowed the inspector's movements. Matteo, hands shaking, provided surveillance. Elena, who had learned to be clandestine in the quietest of ways, slipped in and out of places like a thought. The recorder, Matteo's fragile, repentant instrument, captured Rinaldi's voice pledging favors, promising leniency. It was ugly proof, the kind that made even righteous men seem like paper men. When the dawn broke, Rinaldi's arrest came with the small calm of retribution. He protested, of course. He had stunted ambitions and a vivid talent for self-justification. But the evidence piled up, and the city's appetite for scandal devoured him. Salvatore watched each development with a face that had the tired relief of someone who had paid a debt and found the coin slightly polished, but still heavy. In the days after, as the inspector was led away under a buzz of indignation and the city's news cycle feasted, Elena sat in her shop surrounded by survivors. Customers came and bought roses and did not ask awkward questions. People exchanged looks that were sometimes pitying, sometimes respectful. Matteo came less often, but when he did, his apologies were small and practical. Help with deliveries, a hand fixing a broken sign. He never asked for redemption with words. He tried to earn it with labor. Salvatore came too, but their exchanges were changing. They were no longer only bargaining. Sometimes he stood in her doorway with a cup of coffee in hand, an oddly domestic offering from a man whose life was usually metallic, and watched the way she worked. She saw lines soften in his face when he believed no one else was looking. A strange, slow tenderness threaded through them, an unsmiling promise that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with the odd generosity of a man discovering he could feel something other than ownership. On a night that smelled of rain and lemon oil, as Elena tied a bouquet for a woman who had asked for peonies for a life beginning again, Salvatore came to the counter and, without ceremony, kissed her. It was not the great cinematic thing she had imagined in secret nights. It was small and practical and sure, like a promise sealed with a gloved hand. His mouth was the same as his hands, controlled, careful, with a hint of roughness. For a moment, the world slipped into a hollow where only the two of them existed, hushed by petals and the steady sound of Palermo breathing around them. When he drew back, his forehead rested against hers. "I will keep you in play," he said, quietly, "but not as a prize, as a person who chooses to be with me." Elena tasted the salt of tears, sudden and uninvited. It was not the end of wounds. Matteo's betrayal would leave scars. The inspector's arrest would not erase the ledger of debts she still carried. But in that small, immediate contact, there was something like reclamation. She had fought to be seen not as a thing to be traded, and finally, in a fierce, unexpected way, she felt acknowledged. "I will choose," she said. It was the smallest of rebellions and the largest of promises. Behind them, Palermo kept turning, streets full of stories, eyes that watched for danger, hands that rose for favors and for justice. La Rosa Sincera was open the next morning, the bell above the door ringing with a dull, contented sound. Elena placed a bouquet in the window as if to say that life would continue, messy, beautiful, dangerous, full of petals and the secret weight of what lies beneath. Some bargains are made with paper and numbers, other bargains are made with the softer stuff, trust, the risk of being seen, the willingness to be held. In the aftermath of the theater they had staged, Elena felt like someone beginning to learn a new grammar, how to balance self-preservation with the perilous gift of letting someone else stand guard. If this was a claim, she thought, she would claim herself first, and then, if she wished, she might claim the man who had decided to keep her in play. They fell into a rhythm neither of them had been taught. Mornings belonged to the shop, to pruning, to taking orders, to the slow, holy labor of choosing stems that would mean something to the people who needed them. Afternoons were negotiations of a different sort, men in suits who owed favors, couriers who arrived with envelopes stamped in ink that smelled of other people's destinies, Matteo showing up with his hands raw from work and a face that had learned humility the way some learn prayer. Nights belonged to choices. Sometimes Salvatore stayed until the shutters clicked into place and the lamp above the counter threw a private, forgiving light over their hands. Other nights she shut the door alone and listened to the city breathe around the frame. She kept the pistols, not because she wanted to be a soldier, but because the soil that had held them felt, in some stubborn way, like family. They were a reminder that tenderness and danger had both been planted in her by a father who had loved clumsily and poorly. But their place shifted. No longer hidden as a shameful ledger beneath the roses, they were inventoried, accounted for, and stored in a small, plain chest in the back room with Salvatore's signature on the logbook. He never touched them without asking, and when he did, he handled them with the same cautious reverence he used on the rare times he confessed things in inches. "I fear losing more than I fear being loved," he once said, voice low and startlingly honest. Those admissions taught her to inventory feelings the way she had learned to inventory stems, by name, by need. Matteo rebuilt himself slowly. He mended fences with quiet labor, repairing a broken greenhouse pane, replacing soil that had turned sour, learning to ask for forgiveness in deeds before he asked for words. Sometimes Elena would catch him watching her at the bench and see the guilty boy she had known reshaped into a man who punished himself by trying to be better. He never expected gratitude. He accepted the small exchanges she offered: an extra sprig of rosemary tied in with a bouquet, a nod that said, "I see you trying." Salvatore remained an immutable horizon in her days, a man whose world was carved from harder rock than most knew how to chip. But being with Elena smeared the hard edges. He learned to sit in small rooms that smelled of sap and lemon and listen without immediate correction. He learned, finally, how to wait. Once, when a delivery ran late and a customer wept over a bouquet that reminded her of a child she had lost, Salvatore did not offer analysis or orders. He put his large hand over the small one on the counter and let silence be what healed. There were mornings when Elena walked to her father's grave with roses she had chosen herself, not for concealment, but for truth. She laid them down and smoothed the petals with a hand that had learned new tenderness. "I kept the shop," she said sometimes into the limestone that held his name, and the words felt less like excuses and more like a ledger finally balanced by what she had chosen rather than what had been chosen for her. The city hummed behind her, indifferent and miraculous both. La Rosa Sincera became a place where people learned to tell true stories again. Brides who wanted peonies and apologies for past wrongs. Widowers who bought stems to practice gratitude. Girls who came to learn how a life could be arranged in a vase and not emptied. Elena taught a few of them to prune, to cup a bloom and watch how fragile things could still carry perfume. She taught Matteo, too, how to fold a letter the way her father had taught her, not to hide secrets anymore, but to honor them. And Salvatore, he would stand sometimes at the doorway, not as a gatekeeper, but as a man who'd been surprised into tenderness. He bought a single stem on occasion, paid in cash with eyes that said, without words, "I chose this." When he and Elena walked the alleys on slow evenings, they spoke less of transactions and more of small votes, for mercy, for safety, for what each would allow the other to carry. The pistols stayed buried in the past in one meaningful way. Elena planted a rose bush for every weapon she returned to the chest, and the bushes grew dense and fragrant and thorned. The thorns comforted her with their honest warning. Beauty has limits. Love has limits. Trust is negotiated like a contract signed in shared soil. On a late summer afternoon, with the street dusted by the golden kind of light that makes everything look like a memory, she stood at the counter arranging a bouquet while the bell above the door chimed like a small, happy verdict. Salvatore lingered in the doorway, coat off, sleeves rolled in a domestic gesture that would once have surprised them both. Mateo watered the back pots with the careful thoroughness of someone practicing atonement. A child leaned against the window and watched the world inside with eyes that believed nothing terrible would happen if a woman loved flowers. Elena tied the stems together, the ribbon sliding soft as a promise over her fingers. Then she stepped back and looked at the shop, at the cool jars, the scuffed counter, the list of customers thumbed with use. She thought of the things she had had to hide, the bargains she had made, the men who had come and gone as weather. She thought of the man who had learned how to be patient enough to be kind, and of the boy who had learned how to be small and then tried to become better. She set the bouquet in the window where the light would find it, and let the bell ring when it closed. Outside, Palermo moved on. Inside, for a second, time felt like something they had earned together, messy and dangerous and breathtakingly possible. A petal fell from the bouquet and traced a slow, quiet arc to the counter. Not an ending, Elena thought, but a new kind of beginning. She caught it between two ink-stained fingers and smiled, small and certain, as if the world had finally understood what to do with the weight beneath the roses.